Hello, my name is Jet Smith, and welcome back to another video on my channel. I'm the head coach for speech and debate at Highland High School in Pocatello, Idaho, and this video is going to teach you all about the rewilding topic for the November-December cycle of 2025 in Lincoln-Douglas debate. The topic specifically reads, "The United States ought to rewild substantial tracts of land." In this video, we'll do a few things. We'll talk about what the resolution is asking us to debate about or what it means. Then we'll discuss framework or how the judge should evaluate the arguments. And then I'll give you 9 affirmative arguments and 9 negative arguments that you could read in your debates. So let's begin by analyzing the resolution itself through these 5 things. Trichotomy, what type of topic is it? Definitions, what are the key terms? Background, what do we need to know to debate this and what inspired the topic to be written? Stakeholders, what are the groups most affected by the outcome of the topic? And finally, core issues, what is really at stake here? So first up on trichotomy, is the resolution a policy, a fact, or a value motion? Well, it is a policy motion because there is an actor, being the United States, the word ought, and an action, which is to rewild substantial tracts of land. Now, that means that you can debate this in a more policy sense or still in a more philosophical sense, but it should still be about philosophy regarding action. Now, what do the parts of the topic that we need to understand most mean? Well, to rewild means protecting ecosystems and biodiversity by returning land that has been developed or influenced by human activity back to a pre-human state. It is typically focused on the 3 C's: cores, corridors, and carnivores. And we'll explain more of what those mean a little bit later. This could mean that we don't allow fishing, hunting, and harvesting, or that we don't allow livestock grazing on land. It could mean removing barriers that were made by humans, such as man-made dams, fences, and roads. It could mean benign neglect, as in leaving things alone on purpose to let them grow over, planting depleted or removed native plant species, and reintroducing highly interactive species like beavers, wolves, and bears to ecosystems. Now, a substantial tract of land is just a large piece of land designated as a distinct unit capable of sustaining a farming or developmental operation. So, why are we debating this topic? A couple of important pieces of background information to know is that first, rewilding focuses mostly on cores, areas of the wild without human intervention, connecting corridors between those cores to allow for migration of animals, and then reintroducing large carnivores, which would typically most often be wolves. Passive rewilding is more of a different strategy. It's spontaneous, just kind of letting the land do its own thing and grow over, and removing what was there and then letting nature take its course. Now, the species that are most critical to rewilding efforts are keystone species such as wolves, beavers, and bears. And it is a pretty radical ecological idea compared to more moderate conservation or restoration efforts. It's a lot more anti-human in its positioning than a lot of environmental points are. It's also important to understand that you can't really rewild something unless it has been unwilded, aka if land doesn't really currently have a lot of human inhabitation or visitation or interaction, then it doesn't really need to be rewilded. So the likelihood of backlash can be pretty high because you're only going to rewild land that humans are currently interacting with. And most often that is farmers and ranchers, and potentially, people in forest service and outdoor recreation. Now, rewilding is also really close to environmental issues. So this is definitely an environment topic. So you'll be talking about things like water protection, biodiversity loss, the food chain, climate change, and all those types of things. So, what are the stakeholder groups or groups of people most likely to be affected by the outcome of this topic? Well, farmers and wildlife recreation companies and livestock and ranchers are probably the interests, at least economically, that are most tied to the topic. But you also have to consider rural communities that are most likely the prime target because they're the easiest to rewild. Obviously, rewilding New York City is probably not possible at this point. But also you have to consider the fossil fuel industry, removing oil rigs and other fracking operations from land would probably affect the fossil fuel industry. You also would consider non-human life as a stakeholder group, different animal and plant species that could be benefited from this proposal. And you also want to consider indigenous people in any topic that is about the land and about relationships to the land, how it is used, and who has the right to make decisions about what is done on that land. What are the main issues that you are going to be debating, or where is the core clashes or disagreements on this topic? The idea of land sparing versus land sharing. So, land sharing is more of the negative position, which is that humans can share the land with other ecosystems, whereas land sparing is that we should spare land from human interaction in the first place. We also have the kind of back and forth of restoration versus conservation. Should we just focus on avoiding losing what we already have environmentally, or do we need to try and bring nature back to what it was? And then lastly, we have to think about the protection of the environment versus the development of the environment. Is protecting the environment worth losing the development we already have, or the development that we could have, if we choose not to rewild? So now that we know what the topic is about, let's discuss how you can tell the judge to make an ethical decision when evaluating debates, aka the framework through the value premise and the value criterion. There are two main values that work on this topic. The first one is morality, because the topic is about what ought to be done, and the word ought implies a discussion of moral obligation. Cases that are focused on ecology and ethical concerns, environmentalism, will probably work well with this option. And I would say that the affirmative will most likely see the most benefits from going for morality as a value. Whereas the negative will more benefit from the governmental legitimacy side of things, which is your other option as a value. Because the topic is about US government decisions, then the ultimate goal might be, is the government legitimate if it makes this decision? And cases about rights, libertarianism, cases more about, is it proper to tell human citizens what to do, would work better with this type of value. And I would say that most often this will be better for the negative. Granted, both values could work on both sides. So now that we know what the ultimate goal of a judge trying to be ethical would be, we have to tell them how to make that ethical decision, and that comes through the value criterion. I've got a couple of different philosophers or branches of philosophy under each of these values that you could look into. If you want to value governmental legitimacy, you could look into Thomas Hobbes' political theory of protecting citizens as a measurement of political legitimacy. You could look into P.E. Digesser in maintaining just institutions. You could also examine libertarianism, or resisting government intrusion, as well as constitutionalism, ensuring consistency with the Constitution. Some value criterion options for the morality value could be Immanuel Kant's theory of respecting human dignity, John Stuart Mill's more utilitarian philosophy of maximizing expected well-being, Andrew Linklater's philosophy of fulfilling one's duty to avoid harm, and Ross's philosophy of fulfilling one's foundational duties. So now that we know how the judge would evaluate arguments on the topic and what the topic means, how will the affirmative, or the agreeing side of this topic, prove that the resolution is true? Here are 9 affirmative arguments about why we ought to rewild substantial tracts of lands in the United States. The first affirmative argument is that we have an ethical responsibility to protect nature. You'd claim that currently wildlife populations have significantly declined over the last 50 years in the US, but if we rewild, then ecological processes and keystone species will be restored, which will rebuild animal and plant populations necessary for a self-sustaining ecosystem, which is good because it will help us avoid biodiversity loss. It will help us avoid disruption of food supplies. It will fulfill our obligation to respect nature as, a non-human entity equally as worthy of rights as what we have. The next argument area that the affirmative could talk about is carbon sequestration, which is the idea that climate change is getting worse now because CO2 is getting higher. But if we rewild, then ecosystems like forests, peatlands, and wetlands will be strengthened, which helps to absorb and store atmospheric carbon, helping us resist climate change and avoid its worst effects. The third affirmative argument area you could discuss is reducing soil erosion and flooding risks. Natural vegetation removal from human activity in land means that there's not enough root structures or canopy coverage in areas, which exposes it to the erosion of soil and increases the risk of flooding. But if we rewild, then there will be greater tree growth, more canopies that cover the ground, slowing the rate at which water is hitting the ground, and deeper root systems, which will help water travel deeper underground. And this means that soil will be eroded less often, devastating flooding will happen less often, forest fires could be prevented, and there will be less pollution from floods as well. Fourth affirmative argument area is increasing ecotourism. There are a lot of rural areas right now that are facing depopulation and are having to rely too much on commodity extraction or fossil fuels. But if we rewild, then nature will have opportunities for nature-based economies focused on ecotourism or visiting places to interact with nature. This will create jobs and also increase economic activity by attracting people to visit previously abandoned communities. Now, the confusion here might be that if you rewild, it means no human activity at all. Now, the debate is, can humans interact in the environment as long as they are not developing it or using it for specific activities? So could we hike through an area as long as we're not building a hiking trail or a nature, lookout or something like that? And I think that this affirmative argument would say that people will still be able to interact with nature. You just won't be able to build or develop that land in nature, which means that there are still opportunities for ecotourism. Fifth affirmative argument area is restoring the stewardship of land to indigenous tribes. Now, previous efforts to conserve nature have pretty much removed the consideration of indigenous people, or removed them physically from their ancestral homelands to create nature parks and reserves, rather than just letting the people who have been taking this care of this land for generations and centuries continue to do so. Now, rewilding efforts on federal lands can actually prioritize indigenous perspectives and knowledge to make sure that we can restore wildlife populations and simultaneously indigenous access to this land that is being rewilded, which is good for social and environmental justice. It allows for nature to recover and to respect the sovereignty of indigenous tribes. Sixth affirmative argument area is about improving water quality. In the status quo, we're doing a lot that is affecting water negatively, such as agriculture, grazing and livestock, and pollution, which is degrading the capacity of waterways and water reserves to provide human beings and other non-human beings with clean water. But if we reintroduce keystone species like beavers, then fish habitats will improve. There will be greater water and sediment productivity and cycling, and there will be better habitat protection that all results in water quality going up and increasing access to fresh water, which means that people's basic needs and health will be maintained in addition to food security. The seventh affirmative argument area is about wildfire risk and how rewilding can reduce it. The west part of America is facing a lot of droughts, extreme heat waves, and worsened ecosystems, all of which is creating these massive wildfires pretty constantly. But if we rewild, then there will be better natural resistance and resilience to fire. And that means that communities and natural landscapes will suffer less often from uncontrollable fire damage, or the fire will be more contained and stopped by the rewilded area before it can get to more commercialized, unwilded areas, I suppose. Eighth affirmative argument area is about restoring and protecting biodiversity. This talks about how wildlife populations have gotten much, much worse. And if we rewild, then the ecological processes and important species will be restored, which means that we will not lose our global food supply and there won't be a spread of diseases. I forgot to change the wording on the first argument about respecting nature. That one was more about understanding that non-human beings' lives and life itself is worthy of respect, and we need to stop seeing it only as a tool. Whereas this argument is more consequentialist in terms of protecting biodiversity to avoid cascading effects down the food chain. The ninth and final affirmative argument area is about improving urban health. Now, urbanization, or everybody moving into cities and farther away from natural green spaces, means that we have less access to nature opportunities now. But if we rewild and we introduce native plants and animals in areas, then that will maintain ecological balance and give people even living in urban areas greater access to green spaces, to natural places, which will improve their health and improve their well-being and connection with nature. Now let's talk about 9 negative arguments or reasons why we ought not rewild substantial tracts of land. The first negative argument area is about human and wildlife interaction. Essentially, if you rewild, then you are increasing the likelihood that humans come into contact with dangerous wildlife species in those areas, which right now is limited and preventable. But if we rewild and apex predators and large carnivores are put into places that were previously or currently inhabited and visited by human beings, then there will be physical safety concerns for local communities and for any human that visits these areas. The next negative argument area is about damage to agriculture. This is largely the most common most research-based negative argument on the topic, and that is that agriculture is strong now. We are, we have a lot of ranchers, we have a lot of grazing, we grow a lot of plants, and if we rewild, then we are going to remove land that is currently used for farming and agriculture, and we're also going to expose livestock to predators being reintroduced, wolves and bears and things like that, and that will harm those livestock populations, decreasing meat production, as well as removing land for crops and grazing, which will also, harm plant production as well, which will hurt the economy, destroy jobs, and likely harm the food supply. Third argument is about pushing out locals who live near or on areas targeted for rewilding. Many communities rely on human development and participation and interaction and changing of land. And if we rewild, then we have to push those people off that land and either take it from them or buy it from them and destroy, this basis for rural economic activity. And that's bad because it means that you are displacing people, you are increasing potentially homelessness and poverty, particularly in rural communities. Fourth negative argument area is that rewilding is incredibly expensive. The government spends not a lot on conservation efforts right now, given the current state of the White House, and rewilding will require substantial investment and long-term financial commitment for land acquisition, for establishing infrastructure, and for compensation programs. We have to buy the land, or we have to take it from people and then give them money to say sorry or compensate industries. You have to build infrastructure, even natural infrastructure, to try to create those corridors to connect different cores of rewilded land for the animals. And this will either increase the national debt, require greater taxes, or result in less spending on other financial priorities, all of which could be argued to be bad. Fifth negative argument area is offshoring environmental harm. This is also known as leakage in the literature base. This is essentially saying that right now the US is relying on its own production of fossil fuels, natural resources, agriculture, and we're reducing our dependence on foreign nations. But by rewilding, we are essentially going to take all of those activities that are bad for the environment, but create stuff that Americans need and want. And instead of it happening on American soil, we're just going to ship it off to other countries and then have to buy those products and bring them here, which means that all of the same environmental damage is still happening. It's just happening somewhere else, and you're increasing all of the environmental damages of just having to ship that stuff from across the world and import it to the United States. So you're not really solving anything. You're just pushing it somewhere else and therefore actually making it worse or putting the harm on exploited countries. The sixth negative argument area on this topic is about invasive species. Now, we're dealing with invasive species across the United States now, but they're still causing problems in a lot of areas of nature. But if we reintroduce new species and completely get rid of human interaction with ecosystems, then places that are dealing with invasive species that humans originally brought there, or that humans are the only reason they haven't completely taken over, then those invasive species will actually take over and destroy the environment, which will harm biodiversity, increase the spread of diseases, and disrupt the food chain. Essentially, human interaction is needed to stop the problem of invasive species. The seventh negative argument area is about violating property rights. This is a very philosophical, traditional LD argument that essentially says right now we are respecting people's right to property and land ownership. But if we rewild, then the federal government will be trying to revoke or encroach on people's property rights to rewild their territory, which will spark massive legal challenges, potentially creating court clog if you want to go that route, but also just violating the fundamental liberties of US citizens. The eighth negative argument area is that rewilding is colonialist with anti-human rhetoric. This is essentially saying that the idea that in order to improve ecology, or the philosophical arguments of trying to rewild are based on this understanding of nature as previously the pristine wilderness, which meant no human contact, which is utterly untrue and ignores the history of indigenous people that have always been on this land and their relationship to the land and the water. And if we rewild, then we are essentially embracing an anti-indigenous effort that sees all human presence as equal and all antithetical to wildness, which is bad because it means that we will continue to marginalize and displace the ideas, the priorities, the wishes, and the relationships of indigenous people to their land. The ninth negative argument I have is a conservation counterplan, where essentially you say that rather than rewilding, which is a more radical alternative, we should instead increase wildlife conservation and protection efforts, which could be a lot of different things. You could target it to be specific to whatever the affirmative's advantage areas are. And you would argue that this can still preserve and restore environmental conditions, but it avoids trade offs with farming, it avoids trade offs with local economic activity. Basically, find something that would specifically only be bad if we fully rewilded and not if we just increased conservation efforts. So now that we've gone over what the topic means, how judges can evaluate arguments on the topic ethically, and 9 affirmative and negative arguments, here are some things that I think everybody should keep in mind. One, this is a topic that most people have not and will not think or know much about, which means you need historical examples of rewilding efforts and hypothetical potential future examples of rewilding efforts to make your arguments make sense to the audience. Next, affirmatives, you need to be clear on what you mean by rewilding. Yes, this is LD. Yes, this means you don't have to read a plan. But if you were going to say we ought to do something, we are morally obligated to do something, we need to know what we are morally obligated to do. So what does your version of rewilding entail? You don't have to have a list of every place that will be rewilded or every tactic, but you need to at least be able to offer examples that you would defend will most likely happen in a world where we vote affirmative of those rewilding efforts. Both sides also need to think about trade-offs and compromises, as in, if we do this, what can we not do instead? If we rewild, what are we losing? If we don't rewild, what are we losing? Negatives need to be very careful about reading counterplans that the affirmative won't just be able to say, okay, why don't we do both? And affirmatives need to make sure that all of their arguments are very specifically benefits of rewilding, not just protecting nature in general, or the negative can steal it with a counterplan. Lastly, please remember offense versus defense. An offensive argument is a reason that the topic is true if you're AF, or a reason that the topic is false if you're negative. Defense is more reasons it's not true or reasons it's not false. Offense scores goals for you, defense blocks goals on the other side. Do not read contentions that just say rewilding works or rewilding doesn't work. Those are for refutation and attacks, not for contentions. Those do not prove your side of the topic true. They poke holes in the truth of the other side, and that's what refutation is for. So hopefully this video was helpful. I look forward to seeing all of y'all debate on this topic. And if you have any questions or any advice that you'd like me to give in relationship to the topic, feel free to comment it down below. Please subscribe and like this video so that I can continue to make more like it. And I hope that you found this helpful. Have a great rest of your night.